Gabor Mate, whose books have turned him into a superstar in the therapeutic world, notes that healing is not a destination, but rather a direction and a lifelong process. I like to think of it as the process of coming into one's authentic identity. But then, what is a true, authentic self? And how does this relate to living the 7 UU principles? I was told that it had to relate to that. I think it's worthwhile to revisit the principles themselves, especially for those who are here for the first time. So these are the 7 Unitarian Universalist principles by which we try to live our lives. The first is the inherent dignity and worth of every person. The second is justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Next is acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth within our congregations. Next is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Then the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. Next, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And finally, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. I love these principles, and I notice that they are action-oriented. They are an expression of how to live and act within society, but in fact, don't they spring from inner qualities we think of as virtues? Dr. Richard Schwartz, who developed the internal family systems therapeutic model, names these as the inner qualities of the authentic self: compassion, courage, clarity, creativity, curiosity, connectedness, confidence, and calm. He adds to this rather clever group of words that all start with the letter C, another 5 that start with P, and he calls it presence, persistence, perspective, playfulness, and patience. There are dozens of other synonyms that could be used to say the same thing. I like to add honesty, humility, kindness, and doing no harm. But I like to simplify the concept to a single term springing from my own religious and spiritual background. So with apologies to the atheists and the fundamentalist Christians in the room, I call it Christ consciousness. This term may rub some people wrong, but I want to emphasize that it's very different from calling oneself a Christian. And I'm not using the term in a religious sense. Most major religions have their own founders, leaders, saints, and sages who achieved what I would call Christ consciousness, though maybe they won't call it that. St. Paul called it charity in his letter to the Corinthians, which we just heard in the reading. I personally think St. Paul missed a few things, and I think much of the Christian theology informed by his writings goes astray. He was, after all, deeply patriarchal, misogynistic, vengefully self-righteous, and unforgivingly judgmental of all those who did not profess themselves to be Christians or whose behavior fell short of his rigid, culturally informed moral code. But that's another reflection. I have a very personal basis for my views on this. My own mother was a very deeply religious person. But lying on her deathbed, wasting away from cancer at the age of only 61, she shared with me her realization that worshiping Jesus is not the essence of Christianity. Rather, she said what was important was Christ consciousness, which she realized was at the core of her own and everyone else's identity. Core identity is not tied to vocation, race, culture, gender orientation, religious affiliation, educational achievements, titles, or any other aspects we might call the outer layers of identity. So if we can accept for a moment the stipulation that the 7 UU principles are rooted in what I call Christ consciousness, quite apart from traditional Christian theology, we can get to the most important question: what keeps us from living in Christ consciousness full time and from exemplifying the 7 UU principles in our words and actions? My own feeling is that the answer is actually rooted in psychology, especially in the impacts of our early childhood experiences. In psychological terms, each of us develops attachment styles that spring from our earliest childhood relationships with primary caregivers. John Bowlby, who developed attachment theory in the early 1950s, noted that these attachment styles lead to adaptations for survival that shape personality and reactions to the world around us. Perfectionist, caretaker, rebel, achiever, peacemaker, pleaser, bully, abuser. These and many other labels refer to adaptations and coping mechanisms which, like addictions and obsessions, can take control and eclipse our authentic sense of self. Psychologists make the point that the adaptations are developed very early in life and have a valid purpose when a child is facing threatening or traumatizing environments, such as alcoholic parents, domestic violence, neglect, abandonment, anxiety, fear, or even a simple lack of attunement from the primary caregiver. In fact, in our society, I think very few children are spared various adversities that inform how their personalities develop. In the early days of psychology, the conventional wisdom was that children naturally recover from their early traumas, but therapists these days often administer an adverse childhood's events test, commonly known as the ACE test, to get the root cause of their clients' issues. I certainly don't profess to know all the answers here, but I want to share a little of my own life experience because it is illustrative of the theme of this talk. As a young man, I was really insecure, and like most young people, was seeking an identity in which I could feel safe and fulfilled. Being the lead guitar player in a popular Washington, D.C. rock band was not enough, despite the ego gratification. So when I was introduced to yoga at the age of 20, with the prospect of becoming a yoga teacher, I jumped in with both feet. That quickly led to my adopting the Sikh religion and rising through the ranks of the American offshoot of that Eastern way of life. I eventually became quite prominent, a big fish in a very small pond, and for more than a decade, my role in the organization as an ordained minister of the Sikh religion seemed to provide for me a reasonably secure sense of identity. But it all fell apart when I realized that the leader of the organization, whom I had thought was a liberated spiritual being, was deeply flawed and corrupt. I saw it with my own eyes, and I couldn't stay. In 1987, I left the organization, walking away from everything that supported my adopted sense of identity. My friends, my titles, my turban and white clothes, even my family, for my 2 young girls were still at the organization's boarding school in India, where unbeknownst to me, they were suffering terrible mental, emotional, and physical abuse. But that is also another story. The bottom line is that I found myself at the age of 37 without a clue who I really was. Aside from the struggle to survive some really terrible financial setbacks, my life's focus was still very much aimed at finding the security of an authentic sense of identity. It has been a really long journey. What I discovered over time was that being vulnerable, honest, and accountable for my errors and shortcomings was actually incredibly liberating. Along the way, my wife, whom I met in 1995, and who has borne with me through some really tough times, studied to become a psychotherapist. This turned out to be enormously helpful for both of us. Last winter, at her suggestion, I enrolled in a certification training program to become a trauma recovery coach. I never thought of myself as having experienced childhood trauma. But as I dug more deeply into my family's history, in part by taking an adverse childhood events test, followed by several easily available online attachment quizzes that revealed in my earlier life I had an insecure and anxious attachment style, it was only then that I realized there were many aspects of my childhood that had left me feeling unsafe and uncared for on an emotional level. There's no need to delve into them here, except to note that although there was no overt trauma, such as ongoing domestic violence, there were enough things to explain many of the challenges I faced as a young adult. Then there was an added difficulty in my case, about which I had no awareness until a few years ago. Many, if not all, the members of my family exhibit signs of autism spectrum. High functioning, for sure, but as a family, we all had great difficulty in attuning to others and reading social cues. My father, Aunt Daphne's older brother, could entertain you endlessly with his jokes and stories, but he would rarely ask questions about someone else's life. And for those of you who knew and loved Daphne, I think you might agree that much the same could be said of her. My three oldest siblings displayed similar tendencies, and my next older brother was so socially awkward that many people felt really uncomfortable just being around him. I didn't know there was anything amiss, because that's what I grew up with, and I had no other point of reference until much later in my life. But as I read and studied and learned more, I came to realize that I too had significant challenges in being attuned to others. Although my wife has been generously pointing it out for years, I finally started to make, I think, some significant changes through involvement in the trauma recovery coaching program that I'm just about to graduate from. A major part of our coursework was in practice sessions with fellow students, and the experience really has been nothing short of transformational. Never before in my life had I experienced complete vulnerability and radical compassion within a group, completely free of judgment, completely free of criticism, completely free of ego and power trips and defensiveness. And I think I finally understood what had confused me about Jesus' term, turn the other cheek. It never made sense to me. Why would you turn the other cheek? But now I understand it to mean living without defensiveness, being transparent, being accountable. Because when you are able to do that, it inspires compassion, trust, attunement, and vulnerability in other people. I could say a lot more about it, but I'm going to cut it short with this observation. Healing within a sick society is possible. It simply requires people of goodwill to be attuned to each other, to listen and reflect back with compassion and understanding and a lack of judgment and condemnation, though not a lack of discernment, to ask questions, to draw each other out in a loving way, to support each other in a shared intention to foster emotional intelligence, to minimize reactivity and defensiveness, and to deliberately choose our words and actions within the ethical framework so clearly laid out in the 7 UU principles. You all know it's hard work, and it never ends until we have gone the last mile of the way, as my great-grandfather would say. And that's it for today.